This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today we're continuing with the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Limited Review. So far we've looked at all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards, and today we'll be continuing with a look at every mono blue card. In these videos, I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each card. If you aren't sure what the meaning of those grades are, you can find an explanation in the description. Keep in mind this video contains my thoughts about the cards in this format before actually playing with the format. I will undoubtedly get some things wrong, but as the format evolves, I'll talk about those things on the channel, mostly in my series called Nitsa Notes, which comes out each Saturday. Also, keep in mind we're only talking about limited here, not any other formats. That also means we're only talking about cards that are in draft boosters. Alright, before we get started, I do want to say that if you enjoy my content and you aren't already subscribed, consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. Alright, let's dive in with our first blue card in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. First up, it's Acquisition Octopus, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 artifact creature equipment octopus at uncommon, and whenever it or equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card, and it comes with the new mechanic Reconfigure, and in this case you can pay 2 mana and attach it to target creature you control, or unattach it from a creature. Reconfigure only as a sorcery. While attached, this isn't a creature. Important to note also that if the creature this is equipped to dies, it goes back to being a creature because it's no longer attached to a creature. Anyway, 3 mana 2/2s that draw you a card when they hit the opponent are always kind of alright. If you can get a blocker out of the way or give them some evasion, they can do some serious work. The nice thing with this version of it is that if the octopus can't get it done on its own, it can give that ability to another creature that is more capable of getting in there. Seems like a decent card. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Anchor to Reality, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon sorcery, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature. Search your library for an equipment or vehicle card, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle. If it has a mana value less than the sacrifice permanent's value, scry 2. So, your typical tutor effect in Limited is not great, and I think that's mostly the case here. You pay 4 mana, using up the Anchor and an artifact or creature in play to search up an equipment or vehicle and put it on the battlefield. In other words, you're 2-for-1ing yourself. Now, there are some scenarios where maybe you run this, like if you have an absurd bomb that's either an equipment or a vehicle, but that's pretty much it. So if you have some really high-costed card that has either of those types, this starts to get pretty interesting. But that's a very narrow use, and this shouldn't be played in your typical blue limited deck in this format, where I think it's going to be an F. But if you have something that's actually super powerful to cheat into play with it, it's more like a C. Next up, it's Armguard Familiar, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 artifact creature equipment beast at common. It's got Ward 2. Equipped creature gets +2/+1 and has Ward 2, and it has Reconfigure for 4. This one was my preview card, and as I said in the video where I revealed it, it looks like a very solid playable. A 2 mana 2/1 with Ward 2 is already pretty close to passable, so adding the Reconfigure upside is very real. It's a nice little creature early, and in the late game it can lend a much needed stats boost, as well as a little bit of protection to a more relevant creature. I'm giving this a C. Next up, we've got Awakened Awareness, which for X and 2 blue is an uncommon enchantment aura. It says enchant artifact or creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you put X +1/+1 counters on enchanted permanent, and as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it has base power and toughness 1/1. This is a weird card. It's flexible, but it isn't good at either thing that it does. If you're looking for removal, you can pay 2 blue to make an opposing creature into a 1/1. It still keeps all of its abilities, and it can attack and block, and this format has a lot of ways to modify creatures, so may not accomplish anything. If you want to pay more mana, you can use it to make one of your creatures big, but not really that much bigger if your creature is of a reasonable size at all, because you have to shrink it down to a 1/1 and then add the counters to it. Overall, this is either a bad removal spell or an overcosted aura to pump one of your creatures. Individually, those things would be an F. I guess the flexibility is maybe enough to get this to a D, but that might even be overrating it. Next up, it is Behold the Unspeakable, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says creatures you don't control get -2/-0 until your next turn. Chapter 2 says if you have 1 or fewer cards in your hand, draw 4 cards, otherwise scry 2, then draw 2 cards. And Chapter 3 says exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield, transformed under your control. This is something every saga in this set does. Its final chapter turns it into a creature. In this case, you get Vision of the Unspeakable, an enchantment creature spirit. It's a 0/0 with flying and trample, and it gets +1/+1 for each card in your hand. This looks pretty good to me. Most of these sagas don't add to the board immediately, and neither does this one, but Chapter 1 will make it a lot harder for your opponent to punish you for that being the case, so you're very likely to still be in a decent position by the time you untap and get Chapter 2, which will either draw you 4 cards or let you scry 2 and draw 2, and both of those outcomes are great, especially because you will have all your mana available to cast those new cards. The creature it transforms into won't always be that imposing, and in some cases it may not be able to stick around very long, but it's at least likely to do something at least, and I think that's acceptable after what you got from Chapter 2. This is an uncommon that really feels like it could have been the rare saga in this cycle. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Covert Technician, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/4 artifact creature human ninja at uncommon. It comes with ninjutsu. This is a returning mechanic that lets you return an unblocked attacker you control to your hand, and then you put this card onto the battlefield from your hand tapped and attacking if you pay the ninjutsu cost, which in this case is 1 generic and a blue. And when the technician deals combat damage to a player, you may put an artifact card with mana value less than or equal to that damage from your hand onto the battlefield. The combat trigger that this has is unfortunately quite narrow. If you aren't augmenting it in some way, you'll only be able to put 2 mana or less artifacts into play with it. And while those are going to be around if you're in blue, maybe you have an Armguard familiar, there aren't so many that you will consistently be able to actually put something into play with it, especially if you aren't drawing extra cards. It is still a 3 mana 2/4 with upside, and being an artifact and a ninja is of course useful, but I think this is just a C. Even if you manage to buff it, you won't consistently have something to actually put into play with it. Next up, it's Discover the Impossible, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says look at the top 5 cards of your library, exile 1 of them face down, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost if it's an instant spell with mana value 2 or less. If you don't, put that card into your hand. This doesn't seem great. It gives you some nice card selection, but most of the time you're just going to be spinning your wheels, getting 1 card from casting it for 3 mana, and most of the time it's just going to feel worse than Divination might have. If you're not adding to the board, you've got to be getting something pretty significant out of this. The upside on cheap spells is nice, and will make it feel more efficient sometimes, but it's still just 1 card. I think you'll find yourself cutting this card more than you'll play it. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Disruption Protocol, which for 2 blue mana is a common instant. It says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, tap an untapped artifact you control or pay 1, counter target spell. So, if you have enough artifacts around and consistent access to blue mana, this is a pretty decent playable. If you're paying 1 generic and 2 blue for it all the time, then it's not a good deal. Cancel is just so much worse than Counterspell. There are enough artifacts in this set, though, that I think this will be Counterspell often enough that I want to give it a C. Counterspells have their problems in Limited, namely that you have to have the mana up at the exact right time, which in a way makes them very conditional removal, but when the mana you need to leave up is 2 or less, we see the counterspells end up being pretty playable, and this is going to cost 2 or less a lot of the time, so that's why I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Essence Capture, which for 2 blue is an uncommon instant. It says counter target creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. It's funny to see this immediately after the other counter spell. Anyway, this is a card we've seen printed a few times now, and it's always fine. Once you get down to 2 mana, as I said, counter spells get pretty interesting, and while it is unfortunate this one costs double blue, it's fairly easy to get value out of it. Most decks will have 15 plus targets, and the +1/+1 counter is a great thing to tack on. It is still a counter spell, and you have to have mana up at the right time or it doesn't do anything, of course, but I think it's a solid counter spell, just like the other one, and I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Futurist Operative, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/4 human ninja at uncommon. As long as it's tapped, it's a human citizen with base power and toughness 1/1, and it can't be blocked, and you can pay 2 generic and a blue to untap it. I like the design here, and it's very cool flavor-wise. It's a 4 mana 3/4 when it's untapped, and in an unblockable 1/1 when tapped. Coming with the ability to untap is pretty nice too. Even if we're just talking about the agent, you can choose to untap it after your opponent doesn't block, which means they take 3 now, and you have a 3/4 blocker during their turn. One of the big applications of this card, though, will be setting up your ninjutsu. It does cost 4, which is certainly pricey to recast, but the fact that you know that this will get past blockers means you can really find a nice way to utilize ninjutsu with it. Now, there's some downsides here too. Having to pay the mana to untap it regularly is expensive, so if you're not actually doing ninjutsu things, it's not going to be great. It's also very vulnerable when it's a 1/1, dying to virtually everything in the set. And it's also a 4-mana creature that will usually only hit for 1, and those things are all certainly enough of a downside that I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Futurist Sentinel, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 6/6 artifact vehicle at common, and it has crew 3. We saw a colorless version of this in the past. I think it was called Iron Tread Crusher or something, and it was fine, but nothing special. It is pretty reasonably costed, both to cast and to crew. It lets you rumble with a much larger creature than you would normally be able to on turn 5 or so, and this format has a lot of artifact and vehicle stuff going on. I think it's a C. Next up, we have Go Shintai of Lost Wisdom, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 0/4 legendary enchantment creature shrine at uncommon. It's got flying, and it says at the beginning of your instep, you may pay 1 generic mana. When you do, target player mills X cards, where X is the number of shrines you control. So I like most of this shrine cycle, and I still think this is a solid playable, but I do think it's the worst of the bunch. Milling is a tough win condition to do consistently in most formats, and that looks to be the case here. And it also isn't that easy to take advantage of it yourself in this format, especially in blue. Black-green is really the only deck with a heavy graveyard theme. So unless you really get there on shrines, this won't be great. The others in this cycle are all pretty nice, even if you have 0 other shrines, and you can't really say that here. That said, it does have some things going for it, namely that it's a 2-mana flyer, which can help set up your ninjutsu, and it also isn't a bad place to put equipment or counters for the same reason. Still, I think it's probably just a C. Next up, it's Guardians of Oboro, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/4 Moonfolk Samurai at common. It's got Defender, and modified creatures you control can attack as though they didn't have Defender. So modified is a new keyword, and as it says in the reminder text, a creature is modified if it has equipment, an aura you control, or counters on it. So a 3-mana 3/4 Defender is sort of passable in grindier controlling decks, and if you modify this one, or other creatures with Defender for that matter, they can attack. That's kind of cool, though not exactly an incredible payoff. I think it's just a C. Next up, we have Inventive Iteration, which for 3 generic and a blue is a rare enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says return up to 1 target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. Chapter 2 says return an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand if you can't draw a card. And Chapter 3 says exile this saga, then return it to the battlefield transformed under your control. And when it does, it becomes Living Breakthrough, an enchantment creature Moonfolk. It's a 3/3 flyer, and whenever you cast a spell, your opponents can't cast spells with the same mana value as that spell until your next turn. So this saga impacts the board immediately with Chapter 1, which is great, because many in this set don't. Bouncing a thing for 4 mana up front isn't a great deal, of course, but you get to do it before generating some very real value with the next 2 chapters, both of which give you an entire card's worth of value. Whether you get an artifact back or draw a card, Chapter 2 is going to feel nice, and Chapter 3 gives you a pretty nice 3/3 flyer. Now, you probably shouldn't expect the creature's ability to do something consistently, but that's fine. But you have a decent flyer that on occasion will limit what your opponent can play, and when it does that, it'll feel downright nasty. I think this is a pretty high pick. It's a little too slow to be a bomb, but I think it's a B+. Next up, it's Invoke the Winds, which for 1 generic mana and 4 blue mana is a rare sorcery. It says gain control of target artifact or creature, untap it. So there's a whole Invoke cycle in this set. We've already seen the white one as well. They all cost quadruple mana of 1 color, and so they're all pretty powerful but difficult to cast. The good news is there is a lot of common fixing in this format, and if you can get enough of like gain lands and stuff like that, you can end up with enough sources of an Invoke spells colors that it is possible, and more than possible, but probable you'll be able to cast it consistently in your games. You need like 12 blue sources to make this work, probably, at least consistently, and stealing an opposing permanent is one of the most powerful things you can do in Magic, as you remove whatever your opponent's best artifact or creature is and add it to your own board. Untapping it might seem like a little thing, but frequently your opponent's best thing will be tapped down, so getting back and actually being able to block with it right away actually matters. 5 mana is a very nice price for this, but again, that quadruple blue cost is a problem. All of that said, this is powerful enough to take very, very early, provided blue is open and you keep in mind the fact that you're going to need some fixing to consistently cast this. So I think it's doable enough to cast this, and it's powerful enough that this does sneak into the lower bomb range as an A-. Next up, we've got Jin-Gitaxias Progress Tyrant, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a 5/5 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare, and whenever you cast an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. This ability triggers only once each turn. And whenever an opponent casts an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell, counter that spell. This ability triggers only once each turn. So he might be expensive, but Jin-Gitaxias definitely gives you your mana's worth. Because he counters instants and sorceries, it's going to be very hard for your opponent to kill him, which means you'll usually be able to untap and take advantage of the fact that he gives you copies of your own instant sorceries and artifacts. This format has enough of those things, especially artifacts, that you don't really need to build around Jin-Gitaxias, although he does get even better if you have a bunch of those things. Either way, he's a bomb. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it is Kairi the Swirling Sky, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a legendary Dragon Spirit at Mythic Rare. It's a 6/6 and it has Flying and Ward 3, and when it dies, you choose one. Return any number of target non-land permanents with totem mana value 6 or less to their owner's hand, or mill 6 cards, then return up to 2 instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard to your hand. So a 6 mana 6/6 with Flying and Ward 3 is probably a B at the very worst. It's just a massive creature, and one that you will basically always have to spend significant mana to kill, since the things that can kill a 6/6 in limited usually cost 4 or more mana in the first place. So like with all of these, this just can win the game on its own as a creature, but if your opponent does manage to kill it, you get a couple of nice options. You can either set your opponent back significantly on the board, or get some spells back from your graveyard. You can also bounce your own stuff, but usually bouncing your opponent's will be better. The latter effect will give you a 3-for-1 if you have enough instants and sorceries. This is an easy A. If your opponent doesn't kill it, it will kill them, and if they do kill it, the value it gives you is still pretty likely to get you there. Next up, it's March of Swirling Mist, which for X and a blue is a rare instant. It says as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may exile any number of blue cards from your hand. This spell costs 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way, and up to X target creatures phase out. Like all cards that do phasing things, this has a variety of uses. You can use it to blank opposing creatures for a turn, you can use it to save some of your stuff from removal, you can use it if your opponent tries to put an aura on one of your creatures, and so forth. I think this can phase enough things at once, and there's enough different ways to use it that it seems like a pretty reasonable card, though it isn't incredibly amazing or anything like that. There will be times where this just doesn't do anything, and that probably hurts its stock. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Mind Link Mech, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 4/3 artifact vehicle. At rare, it's got flying, and when it becomes crewed for the first time each turn, until end of turn, it becomes a copy of target non-legendary creature that crewed it this turn, except it's a 4/3, it's a vehicle, artifact in addition to its other types, and it has flying, and it has crew 1. This looks pretty good. I would already be in on a 3 mana 4/3 flying vehicle that crews for 1. Crew 1 is such an easy thing to pull off, so the additional upside that it copies the creature that crews it is pretty nice. That whole block of text probably won't matter some of the time, but gaining additional keywords or abilities from other cards could definitely be pretty nice sometimes. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Mirror Shell Crab, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a 5/7 artifact creature crab at common. It's got Ward 3, and it has Channel. This is a returning mechanic where you can pay a cost and discard a card for an effect. In this case, you pay 2 generic and a blue, and you get to counter target spell or ability unless its controller pays 3. So this is either an overcosted 5/7 or an overcosted mana leak. As is usually the case with these channel cards though, having the option between those things is much better than those things are individually. In this case, I do think both of the options are so underwhelming that this is probably just a C-, and a card you end up cutting a significant chunk of the time. Next up, it's Mnemonic Sphere, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common artifact. You can pay 1 generic and a blue to sack it and draw 2 cards, or you can channel it for 1 blue and draw a card. This is basically an artifact-based version of Hieroglyphic Illumination, which was an instant you could pay 4 for to draw 2 cards, or cycle it for 1 blue mana. It's hard for a card like this to ever be bad, since at worst it replaces itself really efficiently. Then there's this format's artifact synergy and all of that. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Mobilizer Mech, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 3/4 artifact vehicle at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it becomes crewed, up to one other target vehicle you control becomes an artifact creature until end of turn, and it has crew 3. So this is cheap to cast. It has a little bit of a costly crew cost, but it's really not that bad because it will essentially crew a second vehicle should you have one around. And you won't always. In fact, you probably won't like half the time. But when you do have 2 vehicles around, which is going to be very doable in blue-white, it's going to do some serious work in giving you some impressive creatures to attack with. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's the Modern Age, which for 1 generic and a blue is an enchantment saga at common. Chapter 1 and 2 say draw a card, then discard a card, and Chapter 3 says exile this and return it to the battlefield transformed, and you get Vector Glider, a 2/3 enchantment creature spirit with flying. So, looting a couple of times is fine. Card selection, though, like with a lot of these, you're going to kind of wish you were adding to the board more immediately instead of having to wait a couple of turns. As is the case with most of these creatures sagas, you do get great value for your mana. In this case, it's a 2-mana 2/3 flyer that loots twice, but the trade-off is that you have to really wait for it. Still, Chapter 1 and 2 are the kinds of things that are at least useful all game long, so this isn't one where you really need to play it early or you're going to be disappointed. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Moon Circuit Hacker, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 enchantment creature human ninja at common. It has ninjutsu for 1 blue, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card unless Moon Circuit Hacker enter the battlefield this turn. This is a very nice common. Ninjutsu for 1 is quite the deal, especially because it will be drawing you a card when you ninjutsu it in. After that, you'll only get to loot when it hits the opponent, but that's okay. The initial use of the card will allow you to set up for a 2-for-1, and that's pretty nice. It's sort of a convoluted elvish visionary that comes with an additional power, and that is also cheaper to cast when you can set up ninjutsu. I think this is one of Blue's better commons. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we've got Moonfolk Puzzle Maker, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 1/4 artifact creature Moonfolk Wizard at common. It's got flying, and when it becomes tapped, you scry 1. This has decent stats, and being able to scry repeatedly is fine. It increases the likelihood that your next draw is a good one. It also works with ninjutsu just because it's a relatively cheap flyer. I think that makes this a C. Next up, it's Moon Snare Prototype, which for 1 blue is a common artifact. You can tap it and an untapped artifact or creature you control to add colorless, and it has channel for 4 generic and a blue. You can discard it, and the owner of target non-land permanent puts it on the top or bottom of their library. Without channel, this card wouldn't be great. A 1-mana mana rock is exciting, but having to tap both the prototype and something else to make a colorless mana just isn't going to be that great and limited most of the time. It might do something early, but it's just a dud late. But this card helps mitigate against that because in the late game, you can turn it into a Time Ebb effect. Paying 5 for that effect isn't amazing, but like with a lot of these channel cards, neither card individually is great, but together, you end up with something pretty nice. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Moon Snare Specialist, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/2 human ninja at common, and it's got ninjutsu for 2 generic and a blue. And it says whenever it enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target creature to its owner's hand. You know I love creatures that bounce something when they come into play, so it shouldn't surprise you to hear me say that this is a very good common and maybe Blue's best. We have seen 4-mana 2/2s that bounce a creature be very good in the past, and that's what we have here as a baseline. The ninjutsu upside being tacked on means that it can feel a little more like Mana War, since you're paying 3 mana, and being able to do it at instant speed may also enable you to break up an opposing block or something, which is pretty spicy. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Network Disruptor, which for 1 blue is a 1/1 artifact creature Moonfolk Rogue at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you tap target permanent. This does enough to be a nice 1-drop. Tapping a permanent won't always matter, but there will be turns where doing that allows you to get a much better attack in. Meanwhile, being a 1-mana 1/1 flyer in this set is better than normal, both because of ninjutsu and the plethora of ways that there are to modify creatures. It's also an artifact, and that's a nice thing to have as well. If you are ninjutsuing with this, it also helps you set up more unblocked creatures, because when it comes down, it can then make something tap, meaning you have more attackers. So it's one of these little commons that we've been seeing lately that has synergy with a whole bunch of different decks, and I think that makes it a C+. Next up, it's Planar Incision, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says exile target artifact or creature, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. This kind of card always underperforms. Sure, you can reuse an Enter the Battlefield ability or save a creature from removal, but those situations aren't exactly a dime a dozen, and you have to have the mana up at precisely the right time. There are a few cards in this set, like Circuit Mender, that have abilities that trigger when they leave play, and I guess if you end up with a few of those, this starts to get a little more interesting, since you will rebuy the Leaves play ability as well as the Enter the Battlefield ability, but I'm still not convinced this is the kind of card I have to see do well in a format before I'll ever believe in it, because most of the time they just aren't good. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Prosperous Thief, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/2 human ninja at uncommon. It's got ninjutsu for 1 generic and a blue, and whenever 1 or more ninja or rogue creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token. This looks nice. A 3-mana 3/2 that made treasure when it hit the opponent would already be playable, so adding the ninjutsu angle and the fact that it is more generally a ninja and rogue payoff gives you something that's very nice. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's the Reality Chip, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 0/4 legendary artifact creature equipment jellyfish. That has to be one of the weirdest type lines ever, and it's a rare. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. As long as the Reality Chip is attached to a creature, you may play lands and cast spells from the top of your library, and it is reconfigure for 2 generic and a blue. So this is a 2-mana 0/4 that lets you know what the top card of your library is, at worst. That's not exciting, probably a D+ or a C-, but it has reconfigure, and you get to do something very powerful when you do put this on a creature, since you can play lands and cast spells from the top of your library. That's the kind of thing that will just generate insane value for you. The downside is you lose the 0/4 who's actively adding to the board, but there's a good chance that once you equip this, you'll be able to add a ton to the board on your next turn, and that will help you overcome that. It is a bit clunky, as paying 2 to play and 3 to reconfigure is a bit slow, but there's some insane upside here. If you're allowed to untap with this equipment attached to something, it's going to be tough for you to lose the game. I'm giving this an A. Next up, it's Reality Heist, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon instant. It costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. Look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal up to 2 artifact cards from among them and put them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is an artifact-centric version of Dig Through Time. Because you have to have a decent number of artifacts in play to make casting it worthwhile, and you need to hit 2 of them in the top 7 cards of your library, I think this probably has to have a build-around grade. This format, as I've been saying, does have a ton of artifacts, but this card really needs you to be in on them. You probably need like 10 in your deck to get there with it, and even in this format, that's not just going to happen. There are enough artifacts in this format that it probably isn't quite an F in your typical blue deck, but it's probably a D. If you get there on artifacts, it will be a great spell for card selection and card advantage, probably as good as a B-. Next up, we've got Replication Specialist, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/4 Moonfolk Artificer at uncommon. It has flying, and whenever a non-token artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay 1 generic and a blue, and if you do, create a token that's a copy of that artifact. A 5-mana 3/4 flying is kind of an alright rate. It's like a C- in a lot of formats, and the upside this gives you is pretty nice. You won't always be able to pay 1 generic and a blue to make a copy, but when you can, this is going to do absurd things for your board. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Saiba Trespassers, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/4 Moonfolk Rogue. At common, it's got Channel, and you can pay 3 generic and a blue and discard it to tap up to 2 target creatures you don't control. Those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. This is a mediocre creature if you cast it that way, but it has the upside of freezing down 2 opposing creatures, and that's something that can be pretty nice in the right situation, such as those where your opponent is dead as a result of not being able to block for a couple of turns. That mode is certainly the more powerful one, but it's also more situational. So the fact it can be a creature, if that's what you really need, isn't too bad. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Short Circuit, which for 1 generic and a blue is an enchantment aura at common. It's got flash, and it has enchant artifact or creature. And as long as the enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets -3, -0, and loses flying. This is very mediocre. It doesn't stop enough of what a card can do for it to be that effective as removal. Sure, the creature has less power and it can't fly, but it still lets the creature block. It can still have a death trigger ability, it can still have an activated ability, it can still have a static ability, and heck, it can even still attack, just less effectively. It having flash does mean sometimes you can set this up so that you can kill an attacking creature with a double block, and when you can do that, it'll feel alright, but you just won't always be able to make that happen. Sometimes this just won't feel like it's giving you a card's worth of value. I think it's a C-. Next up, it's Sky Swimmer Koi, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common creature fish. It's got flying, and whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. This has nice stats as a 4-mana 3/3 flyer, and while its artifact payoff ability isn't amazing, adding a loot effect to all of your artifacts is definitely upside. I think this does just enough to slide into the lower B range, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Spell Pierce, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant. It says counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. We see this reprinted all the time, and while it tends to be a key sideboard card in Constructed, it is bad and limited. Most decks have very few things it can actually counter, and you also have to hope that when they do cast something you can counter, you have your 1 blue mana up and they can't pay the 2 additional mana. This just won't do anything far too often. Even as a sideboard card, not interested. Giving this an F. Next up, it's Suit Up, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant. It says until end of turn, target creature or vehicle becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/5. Draw a card. These type of effects are almost always not worth it. They keep pushing them on us though. What makes them bad is the fact that you only resize a creature. Making one into a 4/5 for 3 mana is not normally going to be a very good rate, and that's even if you're including the ability to turn vehicles on like this can. You're going to get a small stats boost in most cases, and that just isn't worth the risk of getting blown out by removal. They did do one thing here that makes it interesting though. They added a cantrip. That certainly makes this better, as at worst you can sort of cycle it for 3 mana, and if you do manage to resize a creature and win combat, you'll actually feel like you're doing something, but it still isn't very good for the same reason these effects never are. They don't do enough for their cost, and they're also risky. Normally, though, I give these an F, and I think with the cantrip effect, we can call this a D+. Next up, it's Tameshi, Reality Architect, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 legendary Moonfolk Wizard at rare. Whenever 1 or more non-creature permanents are returned to hand, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn, and you can pay X and a white to return a land you control to its owner's hand. Return target artifact or enchantment card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So obviously you're going to need to be returning things to your hand for her to be worthwhile, and I think that mostly means you'll want to be in a blue-white deck, since her activated ability can trigger that all on its own. In a lot of ways, she's effectively a blue-white gold card. Now, you won't always have stuff to reanimate with the ability, but still, in the mid to late game, it has a decent shot at bringing stuff back and drawing you a card, and that's pretty great. She does also trigger if you bounce something to your opponent's hand, but keep in mind it does say non-creature, so bouncing an opposing creature or doing ninjutsu things won't trigger her, sadly. I'm giving her a B+. Next up, it's Tamiyo's Completion, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura. It's got flash. It says enchant artifact, creature, or planeswalker. When it enters the battlefield, you tap enchanted permanent. If it's an equipment, you unattach it. An enchanted permanent loses all abilities and doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. This is a more powerful take on this type of removal than we usually get. Usually, the bummer with this type of blue removal spell is that you simply lock down a creature and it doesn't untap. You don't stop activated abilities and static abilities, but you do with this, and that's a massive upgrade. It's nice that it can even turn off equipment, as sometimes that'll be worth doing. It doesn't happen very often, but I think blue actually got a premium removal spell in this format. I've been burned by seemingly good blue removal spells in the past, so maybe I shouldn't go this high, but I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Tezzeret, Betrayer of Flesh, who for 2 generic and 2 blue is a legendary planeswalker Tezzeret at Mythic Rare, and it starts with 4 loyalty, and it says the first activated ability of an artifact you activate each turn costs 2 less to activate. He's got a +1 that says draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards unless you discard an artifact card. He's got a -2 that says target artifact becomes an artifact creature. If it isn't a vehicle, it has base power and toughness 4/4. And his -6 says you get an emblem with, whenever an artifact you control becomes tapped, draw a card. This definitely feels like you need it in the right deck to really excel. If you aren't in one of the artifact-heavy decks in the format, you just won't be that impressed with this, even with the number of artifacts there are in this format. His +1 is faithless looting at worst, and that's nice, but if you can't consistently use his static ability or his -2 or take advantage of his ultimate very well, he isn't great. The -2 is going to be pretty crucial to protecting Tezzeret. It's nice that he can permanently animate vehicles and also animate any artifact that isn't already a creature. I do think this format has enough artifacts, and blue decks are generally going to be interested enough in them that he probably isn't ever an unplayable card, since the equipment can take advantage of the static ability effect, and you will have at least a few random artifacts to animate. But he does get way better in a deck with like 10 artifacts in it. I would guess He's a C+ in your typical blue deck in the format, and can get as high as an A- if you have enough artifacts. I think that means you can take him pretty highly since the fail case is still a nice card, and the ceiling is that he's a bomb. Next up, it's Thirst for Knowledge, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. It says draw 3 cards and discard 2 cards unless you discard an artifact card. This is a pretty spicy reprint, as it's a card that has seen a ton of constructed play over the years. Hard to imagine it won't do some work in Standard. But yeah, it isn't quite as exciting in Limited, but it's still pretty nice. Drawing 3 and discarding 2 has you break even on cards with some pretty decent card selection, while also maybe loading the graveyard. And if you have a random artifact you don't need in your current situation, this ends up feeling way more potent. I think blue decks will usually play their first copy of this. I'm giving it a C+. And our last blue card is Thousand Faced Shadow, which for 1 blue is a 1/1 human ninja at rare. It's got ninjutsu for 2 generic and 2 blue. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield from your hand, if it's attacking, create a token that's a copy of another target attacking creature. The token enters the battlefield tapped and attacking. This is great. You can play it early as a 1-mana 1/1 flyer that helps you set up your other cards with ninjutsu, and then in the later part of the game, it can come in with its ninjutsu ability and make a copy of one of your other attacking creatures, something that will virtually always be worth that 4 mana. You do need another attacker, of course, but that isn't a big ask. Things get really wacky when you return it to your hand via another creature's ninjutsu, and then later you can get it back into play with ninjutsu all over again and make a copy of another creature. This gets pretty close to being a bomb, especially because if you go the ninjutsu route, you're going to get awesome value out of it no matter what. I think I want to start it at a B+ because it does take some setup for its ninjutsu to do its thing, but it seems really good. Well, those are my thoughts on all the blue cards in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. I'll be back tomorrow to discuss all the black cards. If you disagree with anything in this video, let me know in the comments. If you want to stay aware of future videos in this set review, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to make sure you're caught up on this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.